Our next speaker is the Reverend Colleen Darraugh, and she's been active in Denton County since 1990 when she became the first pastor of the Harvest Metropolitan Coommunity Church, where she served for 10 years. Although she continues to live in Denton County outside of the City of Aubrey, she's been the lead pastor for 12 years at Metropolitan Coommunity Church of Greater Dallas in Carrollton. And in the interim years, she did a variety of things, including commuting for 18 months from Denton to a church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I can't imagine that. That's crazy. That's like, whew, above and beyond. On the day of marriage equality, Reverend Darraugh co-officiated the first Denton County legal same-gender wedding. Over the last 26 years, Pastor Colleen has shared many points of intersection with the UNT community. In the early 1990s, she was a community liaison and sponsor of Courage, the gay and lesbian student group, and offered sessions dealing with homosexuality in the Bible. Early on, she joined the UNT chapter of the National Coalition Building Institute, NCBI, which offered diversity training on campus. And through her work with NCBI, Reverend Darraugh served as a community partner in the development and training for the UNT Safe Zone/Ally program. Reverend Darraugh was often a speaker on campus in classes dealing with homosexuality or feminism, as well as on student-hosted and resident hall panel discussions. During her tenure with Harvest MCC, Reverend Darraugh was active in responding to HIV/AIDS. In addition to conducting many funerals and educational events, her church obtained a grant to establish the first food pantry for persons living with HIV/AIDS and the first daycare center for PWAs. The church also provided space for the first Denton County AIDS Interfaith Office. Beyond local work, Reverend Darraugh was a speaker at a 2001 World Council of Churches consultation on human sexuality, and she was also one of the founders of the Women's Chorus of Dallas. Reverend Darraugh and her partner, Shelley Torres West, were legally married in Canada in 2005, and they're parents of a grown son, now 22 years old. Please join me in welcoming the Reverend Colleen Darraugh.
It's dangerous to invite a pastor to do one of these things, you know. And then it's also someone of my age that this podium is just at the height below my bifocals. So we're gonna take those off and see if I can see it this way and stand back enough to see it. It might work. Thank you for the invitation and welcome here to UNT. As I said, I'm Reverend Colleen Darraugh. I'm a Christian pastor. I am a white woman. I am a wife and mother. I am middle class, educated, immigrant, documented permanent resident, and part of many other groups and identities. I'm also lesbian, gay, queer, same-gender loving person. Whatever label you want to stick on me or stick on someone else like me or perhaps yourself, go ahead. That's me. Happy National Coming Out Day. In my introductory statement, I used all of those identifiers because I'm clear that my stories reflect my social location and my particular perspective. So let's also be honest, my stories also reflect my memory. And since we were told to keep to a time and a transcript, I'm using notes. Say thank you. I told you I was a pastor. But it's important to honor our perspectives and that social location, because just as I say when people go to study the Bible, each person brings their own perspective to the text, and we see it and understand it from our own lens. We could all be standing around a statue describing that same statue, and all those descriptions would be different, and they would all be true. Is there an amen in the house? All right. So, I came out, which is to say I discovered language and community. New Year's Eve of 1979 going into 1980. I'd been sexually active with women prior to that, but did not have language to describe my feelings, my attractions, or my actions. But that's a story for another time. I went to seminary as an out lesbian, but that too is a story for another time. I came to the US to be on the staff of what was called Metropolitan Coommunity Church of Dallas. now known as the Cathedral of Hope. That was in 1988. And in February of 1990, I became the first pastor of Harvest MCC, as was stated in my bio. And that's really where my story happens today, because I was asked to share something about my history and my connections with Denton County, and with UNT. And there's so much history and so many stories that could be shared. I had a hard time paring this down. But for right now, let me focus in on the 1990s and share just a few that I hope will be helpful and illustrative of the many issues and intersections that are still with us today. So as a little background for you, if you're not aware of Metropolitan Coommunity Church's MCC, it was founded on October 6, 1968, before Stonewall, as a Christian church with a specific outreach to gay and lesbian people, to the LGBT community. Harvest MCC was the first church with an outreach to the gay community in Denton County. And we served as a resource to people beyond those who were members of the church. We spoke on other church panels. We conducted holy unions for anyone. We offered studies on homosexuality Bible on campus and in the community. And we supported people living with HIV and AIDS, as you heard in the bio. We provided speakers for events and classes at both TWU and UNT. And also, I did safer sex workshops. That was that era, yes. Now briefly, I want to reference 2 speaking engagements I had on this campus. After having been at one UNT residence hall presenting on safer sex, I was asked to return and talk about sexuality and spirituality. Well, that's right up my alley. I was happy to do it. When I arrived, I discovered that the RA had also invited an ex-gay person in order to balance the discussion or counter me. Now, it was a common tactic to surprise us with such balance. It was so common, we were not surprised. This ex-gay person had been through the ex-gay process merely 6 months earlier, and really had not been around any gay people since that time, since their healing. So often this is the case with an ex-gay person, right? They go through this process, they are introduced to an opposite gender date, they are pronounced healed and trotted out as a display of success. So sad. So sad. My heart broke that night. How I wanted to meet him again several years later. And so on this National Coming Out Day, I wonder, did he succumb to suicide? Or is he out and proud and celebrating today? I really don't think he was healed. On another occasion, I was asked to be on a panel on homosexuality at Bruce Hall. As memory serves, there were 4 or 5 people on that panel. I really can't hardly remember them because as the evening began, it quickly focused into a discussion, debate between myself and a student who was a conservative Christian and leader of the Young Republican group on campus. It became this debate about homosexuality in the Bible, about our inherent sinfulness versus our inherent worth. It was a lively debate, to be sure. The defining moment was when the young Republican threw his hands up in the air and said, "I can't believe I'm debating the Bible with a woman." And like your response, Bruce Hall erupted in jeers and boos, and all I had to do was... And that was the end. There was no more to be said. Seriously, it closed things down. Please notice that issues pertaining to homosexuality intersected with misogyny, assumptions of normality. Hear it? These intersections continue today. Notice too, that when you don't know what to say, you put your opponent down. Sound familiar? Yeah, do not use that tactic, please. That was sarcasm. With the success of the National Coalition Building Institute here on campus, of which I was a part, and the diversity work we were doing here, we were asked to conduct mandatory diversity training for the support staff, employees of DISD, the Denton Independent School District, from bus drivers to janitors to cafeteria workers. They had to come. They were a happy crew. I was the only out trainer at the time. Despite the fact that we were there to do diversity training, I was asked to be subtle and sensitive about including LGBT issues because they weren't quite ready for that issue yet. I wasn't asked to lie about myself, but just to not offer too much. We were, and often still are, an issue rather than people. In remembering how we were sometimes asked to wait our turn while another group was dealt with, where their concerns were addressed, I hope we have learned not to do that to another group. I hope we have learned that diversity is diversity, and that in our wanting welcome and full equal rights, that we extend the same to all people. Again, is there an amen in the house? It can't be not my group at the expense of yours. And I also hope that we remember that the work is not done yet. Now, in the 90s, Harvest MCC and I dealt with institutional and individual homophobia when our growing church purchased 12 acres of land in Corinth, just east of I-35 off Frontage Road. See, previously we had been right on 35 where Terry's Treehouse is now. Some of you may know that property. We moved across the street and down one exit. The front page of the Dallas Voice, March 14th, 1997, has a title, Denton County MCC Battles Corinthians. A little biblical humor. That article details some of our battles with the city of Corinth over zoning and permits. You see, the land had once been zoned as residential, but had been rezoned as light industrial. Churches were allowed in residential areas and they were not allowed in light industrial. However, the property was previously owned by a Korean church group, and they had been operating there for many years with no trouble. It was a beautiful property with 5 acres of open land upon which we hoped to build. Another area that was treed with trails going through it, that we had prayer trails and meditation spots, and then an area of multiple buildings. One building had been converted to be the church, one was a food service area, another building was offices, and then there was the main house, in which the owner of the property, who operated the Korean church, had been living. You see, the city had never cited the Korean church for violations because it was grandparented residential because they were living on the property. So as we purchased the property with hopes to develop, we ran into political and legal blocks, aka institutional homophobia. The seller of the property even gave us $10,000 to use as a retainer for our legal counsel. Isn't that something? Can you imagine? You're selling a property and they give you $10,000. Church volunteers entered the new property with excitement and joy and began painting and cleaning it up and getting ready. I moved into the main house in order to maintain the grandparented residential zoning, and the city began to fight us for our use of the property as a church. We filed a lawsuit against the city of Corinth. Here's your Denton County history lesson. The Dallas Voice issue on July 4th, 1997 describes how and why the lawsuit was dropped following the Supreme Court decision striking down the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. You see, we were fighting government control of where one might worship. Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Does that sound familiar? See, that's something we're still wrestling with today, again. Well, the previous act would have helped us. Today's versions are being constructed to be used against serving gay and lesbian people. True or true? We lobbied the city council for a special use permit based on the grandparenting clause, and it was denied. The city and chambers were packed by neighbors and by church members on several occasions as people came to debate this issue. It was clear that people did not want a gay church in their neighborhood. In August 1998, the city threatened a $1,000 a day fine for operating a church against zoning ordinance. We received notices that we would be raided and people arrested for attending worship, for operating a church against zoning and without a permit. Again, remember that the Korean church had never been cited. We used to say that since I lived on the property, I was just having 150 of my closest friends over for Sunday morning coffee. But here's the deal, we were never fined. There were no arrests. You see, it was a fear tactic. Does that sound familiar? Things really haven't changed, have they? Terrorists threaten to create fear. It did not stop our church from moving forward. However, it really did impact attendance and offerings. Many people were afraid that something might happen, and they were afraid for their jobs and for their safety. Well, the city did not take legal action against us other than blocking the permit. The whole process emboldened individuals and individual homophobic neighbors. Actually, we were only physically neighbors to one other person. You see, what is now the Denton Light rail line ran directly behind the property, separating us from the residential neighborhood on the other side of the tracks. In front were, and still are, empty fields. Some people in the surrounding area put pressure on our next door neighbor to block easement access to our property. That's something he could not do legally, and we retained that access. Others simply sent ugly notes. One man from the neighborhood behind us came to tell me that he did not want gay people in his neighborhood or near his children. And he thought I should know that he was a gun owner and a gun instructor. Again, doesn't that sound like something today? The previous owner of the property, prior to the Korean church, showed up one day and started removing things from the property. When I told him to stop and that he was trespassing, he threatened me. There was a moment when my life was threatened. I don't know what possessed me to respond in this way, but I said, "Go ahead and make me a martyr." And the individual looked at me, huffed, turned, and walked away. All I can say is that really was a God moment, because that was really not a smart thing to say. And I was by myself. It was really not smart, but it turned out all right. Initially, we had city opposition, then individual homophobia, primarily articulated by men, which I think we still see today, white men. And then it was teens. Some local teens, no doubt having heard the hate-filled rhetoric of parents or of neighbors, targeted the church. It was either Easter Sunday morning or near Easter, I can't really recall. But they hit golf balls from a neighboring field at the church parking lot, which resulted in broken windows and a lot of dented cars. During the week that followed, they hit golf balls into the church itself, breaking windows. The very next Sunday, we had deacons in the parking lot with their eyes peeled, and sure enough, those same teens foolishly showed up. They were chased to their homes, the police were called, and we settled with them having to perform community service at the church. But that's not quite the end of the story, because the next thing that happened is that the pride flag was stolen from the flagpole. 1 week later, the pride flag was taken down again and burned. And then the final event happened, when an accelerant, was likely gas, was poured on the flag and on the sign on the front of the property and set on fire. The sign was just feet outside of the entrance to the house where I lived. And luckily the fire did not spread to the house. The ATF and the FBI called it a hate crime. The culprits were never found. However, the attacks on the church stopped. We stood up to hate, and the church continued, and I'll tell you, did obtain the permits. Hopefully, in my sharing a few historical stories here of what happened in Denton County, you're hearing some connections between then and now. Our work is not done. We need out, proud, spiritual activists who understand that equality and inclusion is for everyone and for every group. And I look forward to hearing your stories and to seeing your name in the paper, seeing you change history. Thank you for listening to a few of my stories.